Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for March the 6th, 2021. Hope you've had a great day so far. So we've got some great text for us today. We've got Job 35. We've got Exodus chapter 17. We've got then Luke chapter 20, I believe. And then finally, we have 2 Corinthians 5, which is an awesome text. So we'll dive right into these. So our first is, we'll start with Job again. It's probably wearing on you. I know Elihu's speeches. It was probably wearing on Job as well, if that brings you any comfort. And again, remember Elihu is recapping some of the same arguments, and I think that's probably part of the sense of it's wearing on you. Is probably part of the author's intent, right? It's to kind of drag out this tension that has been in the book throughout the whole thing. We want this to be resolved. We want Job to have this audience with God to resolve everything that'll happen in 3 chapters in chapter 38, but it doesn't. We're still waiting, and I think that's part of the rhetorical effect of the author. And of course, here in chapter 35, Job or Elihu is doing a couple of things. He is again attacking Job for his claims of innocence and basically calling Job arrogant for his demand that God respond to him, and even quoting, like he did in the last chapter, some of the arguments of Job that he's been making throughout the book. So interesting chapter, but a lot of the same that we've seen so far. That brings us to Exodus 17. In Exodus 17, if you remember, we had in last chapter some grumbling and complaining on the part of the Israelites, and I'm not going to rehash what I said about that again, but we have it again here in chapter 17, the first part of the chapter at least. And it's again showing, I think, something of the character of the Israelites, of God's people, in response to His grace, and presenting to us something that we should not be doing. Right? It's grumbling and complaining in response to the grace of God. But incidentally, a nice little connection here between the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus is that there's 3 instances of grumbling and complaining here, and there will be another in the book of Numbers, 3 instances of Israel grumbling and complaining there. And so it's almost reiterating this nature of Israel, especially in the book of Numbers, which is wholly focused on the failure of Israel in the wilderness. And then the last part of this chapter, we have the story of the battle with the Amalekites, descendants of Esau, wandering Bedouin tribe here, people group. And it's the first time we have Joshua in the text, so that's kind of an interesting thing. And it's first mention of writing in the text as well in verse 14. And of course, it's the famous scene where Moses is having to have his hands held up by Aaron and Hur to ensure that the Amalekites are defeated. We're not exactly sure. God didn't command this to happen, but it probably has something to do with the staff representing God's empowering work, and maybe even inspiring the fighters to fight on. That brings us to the Gospel of Luke. So let me turn over there. Luke 20, we have Jesus confronting, this is kind of his day of teaching during Holy Week. So Holy Week began with the triumphal entry in the last chapter. It's heading forward to the cross and ultimately to the resurrection. And after the clearing out, the driving out of the money changers, which probably pleased no one in that first century context, especially the Jewish temple authorities of the day, now Jesus' authority is being questioned at the very beginning in that very famous confrontation. And then you have the parable of the vine growers. And this is significant because in the Old Testament, the vine is always used as an illustration of Israel. And every single time, just about in the Old Testament, I think maybe every single time in the Old Testament, look at Ezekiel 15 for an example, or Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah 4, where you have these parables or comparisons of Israel to the vine, and every single time it's in a judgment passage because Israel as a nation did not produce the fruit that they should produce. And in this case, we have something very similar going on, except that the parable is kind of shifted to say that that the vine is going to be torn down and it's in response to the people who are working the vineyard, the people who are the leaders of this vineyard, you could say. The leaders of Israel had killed off the heir, and this, of course, is a reference to Jesus himself. Then you have the conversation of the tribute to Caesar. We're not going to hash over that again because we talked about that earlier. And then finally, we have the discussion that Jesus has about the resurrection. And one of my favorite discussions, it's in chapter 20, verse 41, where Jesus quotes from Psalm 110, messianic text in the book of Psalms. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Therefore, David, it's a Psalm of David, right? So David wrote it. The question is, who is David's Lord? Well, the first Lord in that text is God the Father. The second Lord has to be the Messiah. So it's a neat text. So let's move on then finally to the book of 2 Corinthians. And here I think you have one of the, Paul in the previous chapter was kind of talking about his suffering, and now he's talking about the beauty of the gospel itself and the role that we have to play. And one of the most beautiful portrayals of the gospel, I think, in all of the New Testament, of what we have experienced is in chapter 5, verses 17 through 21. So let me read that to you. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. So we are, our first creation in the image of God has been spoiled by sin. We are fallen. Our hearts are far from God. In fact, we are desperately in need of the gospel. No one can wake us up out of our doldrums. We are, as Paul states in Ephesians, we are children of wrath. We are dead in our trespasses and sins. But what has God done? He has given us a new creation. All the old things have passed away. New things have come. And he has reconciled us to himself. Reconciliation, of course, is when you have an enemy that's been brought into peace with the one he was an enemy of. And so we were enemies of God, and God has reconciled us to himself through Jesus. That's the only way of reconciliation. That's the only way that we can lose the status of being an enemy of God. And therefore, he has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So as we have experienced reconciliation, we need to go and proclaim that this is possible, that you can have reconciliation with God. You can be brought near to him. Christ was in the world, reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespass against them. He has committed to us the word of reconciliation. And then he says we are ambassadors of Christ, as though God were making his appeal through us. We beg you on the behalf of God, of Christ, be reconciled to God. That's our purpose, right? To go out and to represent God, to represent Christ, and to beg others to be reconciled to him. And then we have this wonderful statement of what Martin Luther, the great reformer, called the great exchange, that he made him who knew no sin, Jesus, to become sin on our behalf. So Jesus, the perfect, righteous Son of God, took on our sin, and we took on his righteousness. So when God sees us, he does not see our sinfulness in Christ. He sees our righteousness, and it's really his righteousness. It's what we would call an alien or imputed righteousness to us, which is at the heart of the gospel, isn't it? So as you go forward today, look for others that you can proclaim this message of reconciliation to, and tell them that they can have the righteousness of Christ, and they can be viewed in the eyes of God as righteous, not because of their own righteousness, but because of the righteousness that Christ has made available to us. So great text here in the book of 2 Corinthians. I hope that's an encouragement to you on this day, March 6, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.